Well, my name is Beatriz Solis, and I am with the California Endowment. I'm a program director with the endowment. I oversee our Building Healthy Communities work for the southern region. What's really exciting about tonight's program is that, in terms of the work of the California Endowment, at least the 8 years that I've been here, we've sort of become far more active and involved, not just through our grant making and giving, but being a foundation that actually listens, reacts, and participates. So a bit different from traditional philanthropy. And then the other piece that we've done over time in terms of building healthy communities, which is really lifting up the issues around resiliency and opportunity for communities, and in particular communities of color across California. But at the same time, recognizing history, legacy, all of these systems of oppression that have occurred that created poor conditions in communities for health opportunity, wellness, educational opportunities, for advancement. The other key element in terms of policy and systems change through a social justice lens is that you can have the best policies on the book, but if you're not increasing power and voice in community through community organizing, through organizing residents and young people to actually be the voice and change, you're not really getting far enough. And I say all of this because I think tonight is a program that really highlights all of those elements. So I really want to thank Laura and her team for being persistent and being patient with us at the endowment to have this program put together. Joey and our Center for Healthy Communities Center, which belongs to the community. This whole center, the conference center that we have, is really part of the community. And that's one of the exciting things that we have here at the endowment, is to use our space to convene, to have those types of conversations that sometimes, we're not able to have in a much broader context. Lo único que quiero decir es muchísimas gracias por salir esta noche a ver y estar presente en esta presentación sobre la historia actual que ocurrió. Aquí nomás podemos tirar una pelota y ahí nomás pasó, pero sabemos que no es solamente aquí en Los Ángeles, que es algo que sucedió en varias partes de los Estados Unidos y afuera de los Estados Unidos. Entonces es importante de estar bien involucrado y reconocer nuestra historia y cómo eso nos impactó a generaciones de mujeres y además de eso de familias, y finalmente cómo uno pasando por estas dificultades pueden sobresalir con una fuerza grande. Entonces, the last thing I say, which I didn't say in English, is the resiliency of communities to own their history, to own their message, and for women that went through this to demonstrate that they can fight on and keep awareness alive. So thank you.
Acá tenían camas todavía.
Mira.
Y yo por dentro sí siento mucho tristeza.
Pues
recordar
lo que sientes.
¿cómo
¿Y
se
por qué
explica?
sientes tristeza volver?
Pues, ¿sabe?
Mira,
Pero tengo tristeza.
Sí.
Wow.
This baby boy became a citizen 1 minute ago. His mother does not have immigration papers.
We're told they should be sterilized to save taxpayers' welfare.
Something drastic must be done about population growth.
The doctor walked in and said, "We cut your tubes." And I said, "Why?" He goes, "Well, you signed for it." I said, "Me?" I go, "I don't remember nothing." And I didn't tell my family. I didn't tell anybody.
They were extremely fearful, being told that you need an emergency cesarean section. You can feel blood pouring down your leg. At that time, signing the consent for tubal ligation.
This is the emergency department at Los Angeles County UFC Medical Center.
Some of them signed right in the midst of labor. Some of them don't even remember signing. Here is this young lawyer, and for the first time telling them, do you know that you've been sterilized?
We are suing HEW for non-compliance or non-enforcement of the sterilization regulations.
It was just the beginning of the emergence of the civil rights movement in the Latino community.
We were talking about abortion rights, all of the issues of feminism at that time. The idea that somebody could be forcibly sterilized seemed like something out of a mental institution out of the 1920s.
It's a claim that we're part of a greater goal of sterilizing the Mexican population that immigrates to Los Angeles. I mean, I'm offended by that. That's not what we did.
The way I felt when I was young, it doesn't change the way I feel in my heart now that I'm older. But it's there all the time. It's like when you bury somebody, you're always going to carry it on your head.
Buenas tardes. Thank you all for coming this evening and for staying to see the film. And we have a wonderful panel to conclude the evening. My name is Laura Jimenez. I'm the Executive Director at California Latinas for Reproductive Justice. We are located here in Los Angeles. We're a statewide organization. We do policy, community education, civic engagement, and community-informed research on issues of reproductive justice, which I think we're hearing the term reproductive justice kind of thrown out there a lot more these days, but I've been working in reproductive justice 20 years, and I'm not sure, and I want to make sure that we sort of talk about this film in a reproductive justice context, that we're all sort of under the same understanding of what that actually means. So reproductive justice is a framework for work that we do, that women of color have created over the last 20, 30 years to talk about the work that's done at the intersection. It's an intersectional framework, right? We've talked about intersectionality, I'm sure, where we look at the work, we do the work at the intersection of reproductive health and reproductive rights and other social justice movements and issues. So reproductive health usually refers to the services. If you go to like a Planned Parenthood, there's a lot about Planned Parenthood right now. Go to a clinic, these are reproductive health services. Reproductive rights has a lot to do with sort of that legal framework and what is our legal right to do with our own bodies in our own reproductive decisions. And reproductive justice is really talking about how those things intersect with other areas of our life, like economic status and environmental factors. So the three sort of principles or pillars around reproductive justice are the right to not have children. So this is where we talk about like abortion, contraception, the right to have children. So this is where the framework starts to veer off a bit, right? And this is where women of color during the women's movement, the 60s, 70s, started to say, well, we want to talk about abortion, but we also need to talk about the fact that, my mother or my grandmother was sterilized without her consent, right? Or against her will. And then the third is the right to parent the children we have, right? And so this is where we intersect with issues of immigration and immigration law, incarceration, foster care system. We look at environmental concerns and how our communities are contaminated, our lands are taken, things like this. So these are the three pillars that we look at when we're talking about reproductive justice and why this film is so important. At CLRJ in our work, we're doing a lot now around story collection because it's very important for us. It's one thing to go out, and we're in Sacramento a lot. We have staff that are in Sacramento a lot working on policy. But the stories that these women told and that these two women who created the film helped to bring to people's consciousness are so important. The policy means nothing without the stories. And this story is important for us to understand as part of the context of Latina and Latino history in California. Reproductive justice is work that we do in opposition to what we consider reproductive oppression. And reproductive oppression is not 20 years old. We're talking about things that have happened since the 15th century, when our cultures came into contact, and genocide and slavery and institutional violence was happening to our communities, right? And so what we know, and I've said I've been doing this for 20 years, and I grew up under the women that did this activism, that did this work, right? So what we know as women of color, as Latinas, as indigenous women, is that we always resist. We have always resisted this kind of what has happened to our communities. And so this story is important to bring forward today. I want to especially thank the California Endowment and Joey Bravo for helping us to organize this and for hosting the screening. It's wonderful to have the support to bring this many people to see this film. We've been traipsing up and down the state with Renee and Virginia because it's so important to us to, and we're so honored to be asked to be with them to talk about the film in the context of the work that we do. I'm here today with three fabulous, dynamic women next to me, and we'll be talking a bit about the film. So as we do our own questions up here, I encourage you to just kind of write down your own questions. You'll have an opportunity in a little bit. But I would like to introduce who I have with me. I have Dr. Virginia Espino to my left, right here. She is the producer and the lead historian for the film. She's a native here of California, born and raised in Northeast LA, and she's an interviewer and a historian of Latin and Latino history at UCLA for the next little bit of time, until tomorrow, she says. She's done a lot of oral history work, specifically oral history series featuring eyewitness stories of Chicanas and Chicanos who brought radical activism to Southern California during the Vietnam War era, and the series Mexican American Civil Rights Pioneers, which documents 1960s civic activism and its precursors in the LA and Southwest of the 40s and 50s. To her left is Gaby Valle, who works with me at California Latinas for Reproductive Justice. She is our Senior Director of Community Education and Mobilization at CLRJ and has been doing reproductive justice work as long as I have. She focuses, as her title says, on community-based education, alliance building, and mobilizing to foster support for the work that we do, the policy work, the civic engagement work. So she really takes the information and the issues that we work on and goes to community, translates that, and asks people sort of what their experience is. So she's helpful in our sort of collecting these stories and sharing them widely as much as we can. And our last panelist is Dr. Renee Tajima Peña.
Not doctor.
Oh, sorry. Renee Tajima Peña is the director, was the director of this film here. She is an Academy Award nominated filmmaker whose credits include Who Killed Vincent Chin, My America or Honk If You Love Buddha, and Calavera Highway. Her films have been screened at the Cannes, Sundance, and Toronto Film Festivals. And she has been awarded the Guggenheim Fellowship, U.S. Broad Fellowship, Alpert Award in the Arts for Film and Video. And she teaches social documentary at UCLA also, where she is a professor of Asian American Studies, the director of the Center for Ethno-Communications, and holds an endowed chair in Japanese American Studies. So welcome and thank you. So I'm going to sit, and we all have mics here. And I guess I'll just start with asking sort of what was the catalyst for the creation of this film to Renee and Virginia?
Well, I learned about this topic when I was in graduate school in the mid-90s, and I was about 30 years old when I learned about the case of Madrigal v. Killigan. But I had grown up in Los Angeles, so it was pretty shocking to me to actually come to terms with this history that was in my backyard that I never knew about. So I wanted to write my thesis on it, my dissertation on it. And Renee and I are neighbors, and so when I was really heavy into the research of this issue, we both had kids who were about 1 year old. So we were both starting our families and thinking about motherhood and our marriages and that kind of life. But we also were thinking about our professional life and what we wanted to do with our research, with our professional life in her direction of filmmaking and my direction in academia. And so she said, gosh, that would be an amazing documentary. And for her, she can speak better to her reaction to the story. For me, it was an affront against my community. It was an affront against me as a woman of color, as a Latina. I felt like this kind of thing could have happened to my own mother, to my grandmother. So I really connected with this story and with the idea that people look to us, to Latinas, as and Chicanas, as having more children than we can take care of. Which is to me ridiculous. When I think about my grandmothers and how well they raised all of their children, and the damage that was done to my uncles was done by society, not by their parents. So I really grappled with this story, and it was a real important story to bring to the wider public and to this audience. So I want to thank you all for being here tonight and watching this film.
Well, I was, as Virginia said, I just had a baby, and I was, pregnancy, childbirth, it's like so wonderful. And I just couldn't imagine that I would be denied, because I grew up middle class, I would be denied the right to have a child. But then I remembered my mother had told me that in the 50s and 60s, when she and my aunts had their third child, they were told, time for your hysterectomy. And she said, why? She couldn't imagine why she should have the hysterectomy. And I thought, well, maybe it's got something to do with her being Japanese American, or, and then when we started to get into the research into the film, and I met a Sri Lankan woman whose parents came here as graduate students in 1974. They went to Washington State, and she was the first child, and the doctor told her, enough brown babies, and sterilized her mother after the first child. And then it struck me that, there's really more to this story, and it's just something, it's a story we had to tell.
Thank you. What are the parallels that you can draw between the historical themes of this movie and current reproductive justice issues?
So with our work at California Latinas for Reproductive Justice, we look at this film in the context of the current. This is not history. This is right now, right? How many of us have family members who've been incarcerated at some point? How many of those family members were women? How many of those women, while they were incarcerated, were subject to the same thing, to sterilization? When they went in, they thought they were getting a yearly pap smear, and that's if they were even able to access a pap smear while they're in detention. A person's rights and their humanity don't go away because they're behind bars. We're in a society that pretends, at least, to say that if you're behind bars, you're paying time. Your right over yourself, over your autonomy, over making choices about your health and your family, the size of your family and family formation, those rights shouldn't go away because you're in jail, for example. So this is the kind of work that we want to just highlight that really is still current. It's not history. And yet, those of us, like Virginia said, who grew up in LA, so you can tell I'm the facilitator because I'm going to keep asking y'all questions. This is going to be the interactive part of the evening. How many folks before today knew about the history at County USC, by show of hands? Really high. So that's a very small percentage in this room. How many folks actually have family who maybe was impacted by these stories? Thank you. Thank you for being brave. How many folks had maybe heard rumors and didn't know how close this had happened, that this was in Los Angeles, right? And again, and I'll pass it on, but part of the idea about making this current context is when you look at policies, when you look at policies of eugenics, this idea that some races are not worth continuing, that usually means poor people and it means of color. And we're at the forefront of that. So all over Latin America, all over the African continent, these, unfortunately, these kinds of policies have existed and continue to exist. So with CLRJ's work, we just wanted to invite you all tonight to think about the fact that this is not only a historical piece, it's actually still current, and to challenge ourselves and our own ideas. It's one of the pieces one of the women talks about in the film. And when we know her heart, she's not speaking ill of people who are receiving social services. She was trying to make the point of I wasn't on social services and they still did this to me, right? That comment implies that people are used to people on social services being treated as less. And this is something that we have to change. We can't internalize that. We can't buy into it with the idea that in Latino or African American or poor communities of any race and color, that we really challenge ourselves and our own families to move away from those beliefs, right? Because sometimes how many of us, we're going to tell the truth, have an aunt or uncle who kind of thought that way? I mean, it happens. And so we need to change that.
I think it's really important what Gabby says to also tie it into the idea of reproductive oppression, to keep going back there also, because when we're talking about reproductive oppression, we're really talking about any kind of way that we're systematically trying to control some community's ability to reproduce. It can be, and we get used to the idea that we, the people who vote, or they, the people who are in our legislature, get to make laws because somehow we are all paying for everybody who's having all of these, supposed kids all over the place, right? And so, I think, we look at, communities of color, poor communities, but, we can even go further out than that. We can talk about how do we talk about young parents, right? People who are teens who have children. How do we talk about people who are in relationships or marriages with people of their same sex, right? And what are the laws? Maybe not in California, but these are not things that are foreign, that some people are not allowed to adopt or be able to reproduce. So I think just, keeping that in mind, how do we try to control communities? How do we separate families through immigration law or incarceration or foster care systems and things like that? Really important. I wanted to ask, looking at the film today, I've seen it several times now, but really looking at the historical footage, but just to ask maybe Virginia, to just talk a little bit about how this case is part of the broader context of Latina and Latino history in LA specifically, and more broadly in California and the Southwest of this particular time period. How does this reflect?
When I was in graduate school, my professor, Dr. Vicky Ruiz, she was a strong advocate of social history, of bringing up voices out from the shadows. That's the name of her book on Mexican American women. It's like Mexican American women out from the shadows. And so it was really important to her to tell stories of people who aren't necessarily represented in the larger U.S. narrative. And so this piece, the Madrigal case, is one of those stories that happened in LA, that happened to Mexican women, Mexican American women, but it's a U.S. narrative. It's not just a narrative about this small little, it's a huge hospital, this major public hospital in Los Angeles. It's about women of color being challenged about their decisions regarding their fertility. And so I think that what my goal is to bring this piece of history and make it part of the U.S. narrative. Because part of U.S. history is a story of oppression, abuse, racism, but it's also about resistance. It's also about challenging oppressive laws. It's about civil rights struggle. So there's this dialectic that has occurred in U.S. history, and I hope this story becomes a part of that dialectic, that challenge to gain more rights for citizenry.
I'm not sure how many people are aware, we do this work, so every year we get to this week in January. Next week is the 43rd anniversary of the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court case. I'm reminded of this every year because I was born in '73, the same year that this case happened, and so I, get my annual reminder of how old I am from the Roe v. Wade case. I think But what's interesting to me, what was interesting to me to find out from this film was that they built the Madrigal case under the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court case. So what kind of connection do you see between quote unquote pro-choice activism and advocacy and more broad reproductive justice issues, such as the ones that's brought up in the film? Or
so we take a look at this work specifically from Latina perspectives, right? So we know that we're not one monolith, but we do have a key areas that we focus on that bring us together around ethnicity and culture and language and family. And family is always the first thing that everyone says when it comes to, oh, Latino communities, you're all about family. And sometimes that's a compliment, depending on who's saying it and how they're saying it. And how many of us came up through our college, if we had the privilege to go to college, came up through our university experience and we took our feminist studies and oftentimes felt left out. But the stories weren't always about us, the pictures weren't always about us. We had definitely the connections about women's bodies and women's history, but it wasn't culturally specific. The issue around Roe is one of those things, right? So on the one hand, we have a long history in this country of women resisting and standing up for each other. My interpretation, because I wasn't in the first wave, is that the sisters on the ground, for real, in the most honest way, got tired of seeing women end up hemorrhaging to death. That was very real. This would have been on the news at least once in a while. This would have been the stories that people were telling each other. That because this woman didn't have access to this one medical procedure, women were dying. But what happened is that it was white middle-class women that were dying. And that's what made the news, right? If we're going to tell the truth, that's what got us to that next level. And so I remember being in school and reading about all of this and thinking, that's great, and how important it is. We were already here. We're not in those stories. We're the stories of the African American women who were part of this struggle. And one of the things that I thought got left out, because I couldn't imagine that it was all that different in the 70s than it is now. I couldn't imagine that the fight was only going to be around access to this one health service, which would be the service of abortion or terminating a pregnancy. But the political fight was so strong that that's where all of the energy and direction, and honestly funding, that's what got funded. So I'm in a privileged position in the work that I do where I've gotten to speak to older white women who were there in the first wave, and some of them tell me, and I appreciate that, they say choice wasn't supposed to ever only mean one thing around abortion, and we weren't only fighting for that, we were fighting for liberation. They're like, you know how your book says women's lib? We meant liberation. We were talking about bigger issues. However, in the context of the politics of the work, that's not the direction we went. And I think, how different would today look if that was the direction that the work had gone? So in other words, some of the women already doing that work 40, 50 years ago, like us, we're looking at a bigger lens. Reproductive justice as a term hadn't been born yet, but I think it was already brewing. And where was it brewing? With the women of color, with the poor women, with the women who didn't have access. Because you fast forward now to 2016, choice is on paper. Choice sounds nice. What do you have to have? Insurance, access to a clinic? Have a clinic near you. Try living in the Central Valley, where maybe the nearest clinic to you, if you're having some kind of emergency with your pregnancy, is an hour and a half away on the bus. So we're just in this really interesting, complex place where on the one hand, we're fighting the political fight to keep the rights that Roe gave women. And just so we're clear, it gave us two things. It gave us a right to privacy so that we can decide what decisions we need to make for ourselves and our health. And it gave us the right to have access to a legal medical service. Now, in the work that we do, I have the privilege sometimes where I get to work with promotoras. These are community women who are doing education out in the field, on the front line. Any promotoras in the room today? Yay! On the front line, doing the work that's really important, and too often at no pay or low pay. We got to work on that. We got to change that. And so when we get to do this work with promotoras, the issues will take some time and we'll really unpack it. And then you get to see the complexity of what's going on in our own communities. That it may be 40 years later, but this right to choice isn't supposed to be one choice. So in the context of our work, we say choices because that's what we need. And this is where we challenge people. Reproductive justice is meant to challenge you, but to challenge you to come with us. And so here's one of them. Whether she's 16 and got pregnant and decided to keep the pregnancy, we have to honor her choice and support her. And she's got to have access to the clinic, to healthcare, to services, to prenatal checks, to access to good food. Because if she's made the choice to keep this pregnancy, she has that right. And we as a community and broader society need to stand with her. Whether she's 39 and has 3 kids already and has decided that she's going to terminate this pregnancy and she's made that choice, she needs the right and the access to go to the doctor, to have services, to have support, to not feel shamed. Do you know how often we're in the, again, privilege of hearing women's stories, how often we hear the story of, again, whether she was 17 or 40 and just kind of coming out with her abortion story and telling us that the common denominator is that I had no one to talk to. Was afraid to talk to my mom, was afraid to talk to my sisters. I thought even my comadre would judge me, right? So we've got work to do, and we're in an interesting, complicated place. Because it's 40 years after Roe, and on the political front, we're holding the line, and we've got a lot of work to do. So any of us in this room willing to say, hey, I've been comfortable, I didn't think I had to fight for choice, guess what we do? And so when I meet the mujeres who were there on the front line years ago, I ask them, this is our new campaign slogan, where's your granddaughter at? We've got to want to invite them to bring their granddaughters to the fight, because the political part of the fight is not over. And yet culturally, for Latinas, for women of color, for religious women, for women in other communities that didn't always have access to even knowing what it means to have access to pro-choice. And the reason we're saying choice like this, does that make sense? It's because if there ain't no clinic, there ain't no choice. If there's no money to get to the clinic, there's no choice. If there's no money to get on the bus to get to the clinic, there's no choice. If there's no friend to talk to get the money to get on the bus to get to the clinic, there's no choice. Choice sounds nice and it's on paper, but we've got a lot more work to do. And in our bigger umbrella around reproductive justice, we want to ask people to stand up, stand with, and defend all choices that women make. If there's no immigration papers, and there's no friend, and there's no money, and there's no way to get on the bus, and there's no clinic to get to, and on and on and on that goes. And so this is where we are. At best, I think we're in a complicated place when it comes to poor women and women of color and women who traditionally have not had access to this very nice thing on a piece of paper that people will celebrate in January of every year. But we have more work to do. And in this coming year, we're going to be, this year, 2016, look out, pay close attention. The ballot will oftentimes have issues in it that can really affect women's lives on the day-to-day. And so the work that we get to do, in the day-to-day to inform ourselves and each other is really, really important. Get on my
I just want to add, I think, the concept of choice is not, and I think we're doing that here as we're talking about how it's broader than just one issue. And I think one of the issues that we're working on right now is on the maximum family grant, which is a clause which has to do with CalWORKs for families that are receiving financial assistance. If a woman who's receiving financial assistance from the state becomes pregnant while she's already receiving that assistance, she is not allowed to get an additional grant for any additional child that she has. And so I think, you can look at our website and get more information about that, but I think we also need to look at, when we have laws like that in the state, what does that mean about who has choice? right? Who has choice to decide whether they can have more children? Because what kind of choice is that if you aren't able to get the support you need to have the family that you want, right?
And we're talking about $122 a month. I don't know what you buy with $122 a month, but has anyone seen the price of diapers? Talking $122 a month. This is what we're talking about.
How, Renee and Virginia, do you see your roles as filmmakers within the reproductive justice or other social justice movements or work or issues that come up?
Well, I'm sitting with you because as a filmmaker, I can make a film. I don't think films make social change. I think that people do. The grass is organized. People have to be organized. So it's the organizers who really make the change. So I just, put the films out there, and, it's you who really are working on the ground and, reaching people and figuring out how it kind of moves forward, this idea of reproductive justice. So I think I'm just like a cultural organ of the movement. We just tell the stories, but you actually make things happen. That's how I see my role.
I want to comment on what Bea Solis said when she was introducing the film about changing the narrative. And I think that that's what our film is doing. And although it does take people to create social change, I think that we're changing the way that Latinos are looked at, the way that we're viewed, the way that we're understood. I didn't realize what family meant until I lived in Latin America, because here in the US, there was such a push for me not to have children, to have a profession, to go to college, to use birth control. And when I lived in Latin America, it was a whole different idea and perception. And so the value system was really different. And that's when I understood that in the US, there's this struggle for items like cars and houses in certain neighborhoods. But in Latin America, there's a real love for family, and that what you get from your children is the same thing that somebody else might get from having a PhD or having a house in South Pasadena. So I think that the film helps us to understand that differently by looking at the Hurtados and how they just really love their children and how their children love them back, and how that's enough. That's enough right there. So I think changing the narrative and changing the way that our communities are looked at is part of what this film is doing, and I think it's really important work.
Can I say something about that? Because Virginia, since when we started the film, she would say, motherhood is a political act. And I'd say, well, that sounds good, but what the hell is she talking about? And so it really struck me, because as we were making the film, we self-censored a lot, because Mrs. Hurtado had 5 kids. And so people would say, well, how many kids did she have? Like, maybe it was time for her to get her tubes tied. Maybe it wasn't so much of a problem. And, we really equate, like, oh, you should only have the kids that you can afford. That's really, I think, the values that we put on childbearing. And I thought about my grandparents who immigrated from Japan. They could not be citizens for 50 years because Japanese immigrants could not be citizens. They lived in Skid Row. My grandfather was a janitor till he was 80. He can barely support his family. They had 5 kids. I'm sure they wanted more kids, but they loved, my family is just, it's everything to me, my family. So, when we met all the women, they were asserting this family is value, family is our life. And we want children, we love our children, and maybe it's hard to make a living, to support, but we find a way. And that was so mind-blowing to me. And you'd think it's like, really should be simple to understand, but I think that we've forgotten that. So I think that's like for me, was a real deep part of the message of the film and meeting these women.
And can I add, in terms of changing the narrative, why is it that we blame poor families for being poor and saying you can't have more kids because you're poor, when what's wrong is that we're not getting paid enough, when what's wrong is that the pay scale in this country hasn't gone up in 30 or 40 years, when what's wrong is corporations write the law for the country that you're living in that then says you're worth less, you're kind of medium, you're over there, you're okay because you're with the... No, like our focus is in the wrong place. And part of the thing that I want to challenge us is sometimes we are guilty of buying into that, yes? We tell the truth a little on ourselves. So it's time to switch that around, right? Who am I? How dare I say that mujer has too many kids? Well, that's not my place. Just like it's not someone else's place to tell you, why did you only have one? Or why didn't you have any? And don't let people tell you that Latinos don't adopt, because like, let me, your cousin who had nowhere else to go, who came to stay at the house and never left? Come on now. My family's from a little pueblo in Jalisco, like a lot of us, right? But I'm so lucky, we still have connection to the pueblo. We have my grandmother's house. A roof is falling off, but we don't care, it's ours, it's a family house, we still have it. My cousin who, her husband works when he can, this is a small town, there's very few opportunities. The neighbor across the street had some violence happen, which was just a whole new thing for a small town. They weren't used to that. My cousin is now feeding her 3 kids who are like teens and older, and the 3 kids from across the street. Don't tell me we don't adopt. Right? We just live in a country that says if you don't have a piece of paper, then your community doesn't adopt. Well, we do. And we can then introduce, carry those values and introduce that into, I would say to my mom when I was very young, Mom, I'm probably going to adopt kids and they may not all be brown. And she would at first look at me like, okay. And after some time, she started sort of getting it. And then now, because I am one of the daughters who hasn't given her a grandchild, she goes, mija, you could adopt. Like it was her idea. It was the cutest thing, right? Like, oh, mija, you should consider that. Yeah, Mom, okay, So this idea around, again, expanding our ideas and our horizons about what we think choice and choices are. So we're going to ask everyone to stand with us around choices. And not just for women, for men, for our friends who are gay and lesbian, for our friends who are transgender and trying to find their place in our community and being safe. The other day I did a presentation for some high school students. And one of the things we talked about are think about it like our basic everyday rights. How scary must it be for a young person not to have a bathroom they can go to and feel safe? Just bring it down to the most basic ideas around our humanity and elevate that. And this group was like, we're going back and we're going to rebrand all the restrooms, but they were clear about the power that they had, and they can go back. Oh, hey, you're in the room, YPI. They're going to go back and go and talk to their the folks that run their schools, and really be able to make the argument around what it means to be safe and something as private as the restroom. That's a reproductive justice issue, right? Being safe, being seen, first of all, as your whole self and your whole humanity. And that's what makes reproductive justice different than possibly the framework around reproductive rights that you might have read about or heard about in college, is we're inviting everyone in this room to be part of the struggle and the resistance. And we're asking that you see yourselves and we see each other as a whole human being.
So I'm going to take the last word here before we move to the question and answer part. I'm really happy that we talked about shifting the narrative. That's something we talk about a lot in our work at CLRJ. And I want to just thank you so much for this film, because I think, in the 20 years I've been doing this work, we get a lot of questions from the mainstream feminist organizations about why Latinas aren't involved, or why aren't the Black women talking about abortion? Why aren't we talking about these things? And I think this film says to us, we do talk about reproductive health and we talk about reproductive rights. And this is, we talk about it because we haven't always had the right to have power over our own bodies, right? We have been enslaved, we have had our children taken, we have had our families separated. We talk about these things. And to go even further than that, we talk about abortion too, and that's what CLRJ is out here to say. We talk about these things. We have feelings and our families have opinions about them. And so we're not just quiet Catholics that are not going to vote about it, right? We have a lot to say about these things. And, furthermore, I think it's important, we know, right? We know in our families, even if we didn't call it abortion, we didn't go to a doctor for it, somebody knew what the herbs were, right? This was always been women's business. And so this is important information that they're sharing with us, today, and as many times as this film gets shows, and as much as we get out there, we talk about these things. They're important to us. I will stop there, and it is now time. I believe we have some microphones around.
My wife was having maybe 3 minutes in between contractions. They're asking us to fill out paperwork and a bunch of questions, and they asked her that, like, did you want to get your tubes tied? And we looked at her, and my wife is like, she's in the middle of some I'm like, are you?
Yes, shit.
I was really
shit.
like, she did not ask that right now. That's something that to me that was crazy. If my wife had been alone, the way it used to be, where men weren't really in the room as much, they were in the waiting room. I could only imagine. And if they would have told her, you won't live, or the baby won't live if you don't sign this, and if she didn't speak English, it goes on and on, like you said, the choices. And I'm lucky enough now to be a part of an organization that does work with expectant and parenting youth in foster care. I'm lucky enough now to meet young women that are doing grassroots work, and women at Thomas Riley High School that are parenting, that do amazing work. And I'm just so lucky to have women like that, strong women that I'm able to meet on the daily. But my question is really, how do those types of things still happen? At a place like Kaiser, we have good insurance. Like, what is that about? Like, how do we get involved? How do we make sure that stuff like that doesn't slip through the cracks?
Well, I don't know. I know how it happens is that people are unaware of what the regulations are. And, this was the whole group of Chicanas and Latinas that fought for this, and they lost this case, right? But they did gain regulations around sterilization. So there are all of, these practices, the 72-hour waiting period, all of that, consent forms in your language, all of that is in place. But I think that, when people hear something enough, when they hear something enough, when they start hearing that there's these brown people are having too many babies, it becomes reality, and they figure that somehow it's their right to ask these ridiculous questions when a person is in labor.
It becomes unconscious, I have the other side, right? So I have a cousin who, same thing, good insurance, good job, blah, blah, blah. While she had a reproductive health issue that was ongoing, but luckily didn't impede the pregnancy. The same thing while she was in delivery, they say to her husband, oh, well, this would be a good time to do a hysterectomy, and they scare him. Now he's got, minutes to decide? So and he's being asked to make a decision over someone else's body. Granted, it's his wife, but it's still not his body. So thank you for, again, we are saying that these stories are still in the current context. Write a letter. I think we feel like in these days no one, but because fewer people write letters, write a letter, make that phone call. I bet, because then we know this, for every one letter or one call, you're actually representing hundreds of people who wouldn't do it.
There's wonderful doctors that have, best interests at heart. But that doesn't mean that you just go into a doctor's office and whatever they say is the word, right? I think we have to, because if you've ever gone to a doctor's office and started asking them questions, they back the hell up, from whatever it is.
Ask the doctor if they would do this to their wife or their sister.
Right here.
Hi, I'm a history student, and I did my thesis on the Madrigal versus Colgan case, and I've been really excited to see your film, so thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. And I was wondering if you might speak, all of you, I was really struck by Antonia Hernandez and Carlos Vélez Ibañez's testimonies about having to go to people and bringing up these really dark pasts that they have buried. And, Virginia, you talk about bringing things out from the shadows. And I was wondering if you could speak to your roles, bringing these histories up after so many years have passed, and sort of what that's like and how you might deal with that secondary trauma as scholars and filmmakers and activists.
When I was working on my dissertation, I primarily relied on the court records. So I never actually met any of the plaintiffs in Madrigal. But when Renee and I decided to do the film, it was imperative that we reached out to them because it's not the same having a visual interpretation of their story as it is to have the written document. So the written document, you don't need to have that visual impact, and so we had to find the plaintiffs, and that was not easy. I mean, Renee and I would wait at one church that we knew Dolores Madrigal attended, and hope that she would come and try to, just from the grassroots, be organic, and try to meet her. When that didn't work, we had to take, it a little bit more intense, and some of the plaintiffs, you can see that it was really different how the case impacted them. And I think it depended on how their husbands responded, how their families responded. So some of the women found it very liberating and found it healing to actually tell their story to us. And some of the women didn't even want to revisit it. So it really depended. Each one was very different. All the 10 women have their own individual separate stories. They're not homogeneous. They're not one woman. So each one was very different. But we tried to be very patient, understanding, open, and loving. And those that were willing to tell the story, we definitely, went into their homes. Like Mrs. Hurtado, she just invited us in, fed us, made us laugh, gave us tequila. It was great.
And one thing that was really interesting is even after 30 years, 35 years, a lot of the families still didn't know what happened to them, and their children did not know. And Virginia spent a lot of time gaining their trust. And in talking to the children, first they knew something bad had happened to their mothers. They knew there were no more babies at a certain point, and there was some kind of bad thing, and they never knew what. And so when they found out, because of the film, because we were asking the mothers to participate, it kind of made sense. But then they found out their mothers had stood up. They were part of this historic case, this landmark case. And they were so proud of what their mothers had done. And they said, Mom, please go on camera. Please tell your story. People should know what you did. And I think that was the most powerful thing for me as a filmmaker to experience, is that I know another one of the mothers, her husband, just went to see the film, and he said to her afterwards, I'm so proud of you. And she can't stop talking about that because it's like after all that trauma, after they took that risk, it was a big risk, what they did, that, their story is told and people are embracing them. I mean, that is like, I've been weeping at like all these different screenings, partly because people will come up to us and say, this happened to my mother or my grandmother, and partly because, we hear like from their own family saying, I didn't know you went through this. And I didn't know you stood up. And so they were like, to us, everyday activists. They're not going to be on a like Heritage Month calendar or anything like that, but they were everyday activists. When they were called to stand up, they did it.
Hi, my name is Josefina Lopez. I'm a screenwriter and playwright. But I actually wanted to have you comment on this particular case. I don't know if people know about it. I just heard about it briefly, about a Latina surrogate mother who's having triplets. And she has, obviously, as a surrogate mother, signed away her rights because it's not, biologically, of course, her children. But she's being forced to reduce the amount. They're basically telling her she has to reduce the amount. And she's saying, I don't want to have an abortion. It goes against. I wonder if you can comment on that, because I know if you know anything about that. Because you think about reproductive rights, but then what happens when you've signed away your rights? Do you still have rights?
I haven't read about that case individually, but thanks for that, Josefina. It's something we need to look into. What it brings up to me immediately is this trend that we started hearing about in the 90s, right, called womb for rent, right, WOMB, womb for rent. This idea that whether it's Europeans or Americans here who, have the money, to pay someone, and often in a whole other country, to be the person to carry their pregnancy to term. And the complications of that, because, you know, a lot of times these families would say, oh, but we're paying these women. And you know, they get to stay in this like hotel and they have 3 meals a day and they're poor, so that's more than they had before. And that's the crux of the problem, is that they're poor. And then this is who's being asked, you know, to be somebody else's surrogate. It's way more complicated. And so thank you for bringing that up. I know me personally, I haven't read about that case, but it's something that we should look into. These, again, the issues around reproductive justice are global, right? Like our work at CLRJ, it focuses on Latinas and it focuses on California, but by no means are we unaware of the global impact about this work.
I just want to touch something really quick that I caught on the film briefly, how you spoke of like the male perspective and the male perspective view in this. I know it was briefly done in the film, but I know like coming from my culture, like the Hispanic culture, the Latino culture, you know, we're taught as young men to be machistas and all that stuff. Even in the civil rights movement, how the men in the front run were always like, no, let's put this behind us. This is not as important as what we have in here. And it's always their word against your guys's. Now, this story touched on, obviously, the women. So I was wondering, when you guys were doing interviews, was there ever a chance for you guys to get the perspective of what that father thought at that moment that this happened, if they were still around in the family nowadays? So I was just going to see, like, if you were ever a chance. I know that one of them was there all the time with her next to her, which he was an amazing guy there with her the whole time. But I was wondering if the other women... husbands were there around, still there, and what did they thought, and if you were able to get a chance to see their point of view ever, or were you ever interested in that?
Actually, the only people who really cried on camera were the men. Carlos, the anthropologist, and Mr. Hernandez, Melvina's husband, was just really torn apart by what happened because he wanted another child, and he felt that he was violated, as well as his wife. So, yeah, they were very torn by what happened.
Yeah, we were able to interview Mr. Hernandez, who doesn't appear in the film, because his testimony was so strong and powerful that it kind of encapsulated Mrs. Hernandez's. So,
overpowered.
Yeah, it really overpowered her story because she was, you know, more quiet. But what she told me afterwards, and this wasn't part of the interview, she said that when he found out that she had been sterilized, she told him, she said, you can divorce me. You know, I can't have any more kids. If you want to have more kids, you know, let's get a divorce. And he said, I love you. You know, that's ridiculous. So she really wanted that to be part of the narrative, that he supported her no matter what happened to her in the hospital back in the 70s. And in some cases that wasn't true. You know, we didn't have a chance to talk to Mr. Madrigal because he had passed away. So we couldn't get his opinion about what Mrs. Madrigal has said about him. But I think that it's very complex. You know, we're not a homogeneous community. We have, you know, so different experiences and different beliefs and different understandings. And when you have 10 families, you're going to have 10 different stories. And that's what we found. Some were supportive and some were not.
I mean, I think it wouldn't take a lot to imagine how powerless everyone felt. The women to whose bodies were violated because they didn't get to make this choice, not in any kind of authentic way, and the partners whose opinions weren't asked, let alone taken into account.
I am a Mexican immigrant. I'm a writer myself, a news writer for Telemundo. But I have just a comment. I have 4 kids, and my 4th child, my husband lost his job when I was in the 2nd month of pregnancy. Therefore, I had to go medical. And I claimed for the service. I had no choice. I was so worried because it was my 4th cesarean. And what the doctors were right away, as soon as they saw that I was under medical, they were like, well, okay, as soon as the opportunity came, I had to have the tube ligation. Therefore, because I see the system is created in the way that if you are receiving public assistance, you are just right there, your mark. Okay, right. This is not, you know, you're the perfect candidate to be part of this discrimination. My other three kids were covered on the private insurance, never a question. I was Latina, I had the kid under the public services, perfect candidate. So that's how the system is. And I, thank goodness, my 4 kids were perfect. I have one here, she's a singer, and all of them are great, but like you say, family, our families are so strong. We want to keep it strong. We got to keep them with values, and nothing is going to break our society if we still be strong.
This is our last question right here.
Hi, I'm Jenny with LA Center for Law and Justice, and I'm an attorney there. So that's the organization that Antonia Hernandez was working with, and we still are there 40 years later in Boyle Heights. And we have actually 2 of our social work students with us tonight, Lisa and Gabby. So we still provide free legal and social services to that East LA community, and mainly family law and immigration law. My question is, I was so curious about the interviews with the defendants. So what was that like, inviting them to speak? And, what's your read on them? Did they have a subconscious bias? Are they just lying to the camera? And what has their reaction been to the film, if any?
Well, I interviewed them, and I think they believed in their testimony that they had done nothing wrong. And in fact, as a filmmaker, it's not a film about the evil and goodness or the heroes and the villains, because I think it was a real systemic kind of perfect storm of all these, there were good family planning programs, but then there was the anti-immigrant sentiment, this fear that, women were having too many babies, they were going to depend on welfare. There was this fear of, overpopulation, like poor people were overpopulating the planet. So all these different, factors came together to produce the environment for abuse. And some of those doctors probably, they got on their shift, somebody gave them a consent form, and they thought, oh, this woman wants to be sterilized. Some of the doctors probably felt they don't need to have more children. So it's, to me, it was really interesting. It's like, why do bad things happen? And who's implicated? I think that, to focus on the doctors, it's like people can say, oh yeah, that happened in the 70s, the bad old days. Thank God we're so enlightened today, that would never happen. I don't think that's true. I mean, to me, there are, ICE raids, women and kids are being, deported. There are families in detention centers, but I'm sitting here. I mean, why? I mean, how are we all implicated in what's happening? Who's at fault? Is it the ICE, the officer? Is it, President Obama? It's his administration? Is it, who's really implicated? I think that it's, the interesting thing that I learned through CLRJ and making the film and the reproductive justice movement is that you have all these different intersectional kinds of factors going on. And it's very complex. And you just can't say, well, there are good people and bad people. But there are all these things happening in our society that creates this, and especially the most vulnerable people are victimized by it. So we have to really think about what's causing these kinds of abuses and how can we, stop it. Part of it is just the kind of personal judgments we make, and part of it is who we vote for, the legislation. There's, all these things going on. So the doctors, there was a whole range of attitudes and accountability, I would say.
And just don't be fooled. The idea around overpopulation and population control, it hasn't gone away. You might be at this what you think is a friendly environmental movement, especially if it's a traditional environmentalist movement. They're the ones that are still talking about population control. They're the ones talking about how there's too many, poor people in the third world having too many kids. Well, guess who that's talking about? They may be talking about the other part of the border, but they're still talking about us. So we need to be vigilant around those conversations. It's not fair that the U.S. overconsumes and what developed countries overconsume to the point that we've caused this degradation on the planet. And to make up for it, what they're saying is that all those poor people over there, which again is our family, our extended family, that's who they're talking about. So the idea that this is in the past is not actually in the past. It is still very present. It is still really current. Say it again. We'll ask you to please, send it, look us up, send us an email, come to our events when we have them. We're going to need you. This fight needs to be fought on different levels and with different allies. And again, we focus on women. That's who we are. That's our expertise. But it's not just women. We want everyone in the room included in this fight.
Thank you. Thank you very much again for joining us. And again, thank you to the California Endowment, Beatriz Solis, Joey Bravo, all of the crew here for making this happen.
Thank you.